Okay. So I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to the first edition of the SOAS World Philosophies lecture series. It's mainly designed to provide space to listen to and engage with experts in world philosophies. And we'll be looking in these lectures at key themes and debates and challenges that emerge from the study or research in world philosophies as a broad and diverse approach to philosophy. And this is, in fact, in the spirit of how philosophy is approached here at SOAS as a very diverse and rich tradition that emerged from the various world's tradition, and rather from solely the Western perspective. And so we do value a lot the contribution of African philosophy, Indian philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and other world philosophical traditions to the discourse of philosophy in general. And this series provides a space to do that as well. Today, we are beginning with what I think is a very important way to start, talking about the very essence of globalizing philosophy. And we have an eminent philosopher, Professor Richard King, to speak on that topic of reflections on globalizing philosophy. But to start that, we would like to call on the subject head of the World Philosophies program here at SOAS, Dr. Sean Hawthorne, to say a thing or two about the World Philosophies program here, and also to properly introduce our guest, Professor Richard E. King. And just before that, please remember to mute yourself, particularly as the lecture is going on. And the lecture will go on for about an hour. We'll have about an hour for questions and comments. And then you can unmute yourself to say your mind. Just raise your hand if you need to. Thank you, Dr. Sean.
Thank you, Elvis. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural lecture of the World Philosophies lecture series, which we're hosting here at SOAS University of London. I'm Sean Hawthorne. I'm the convener of the BA program in World Philosophies, which is a program that has really been intent on broadening the panorama of philosophy as a discipline, particularly the themes with which it engages, but more importantly, the intellectual traditions that it encounters. I'm very delighted, along with Elvis, to introduce our first speaker and my dear friend, Professor Richard King. I first encountered Richard's work when I was a postgraduate student towards the end of the 1990s, when I read his now very famous book, Orientalism and Religion, which was published in 1999, in which he addressed, and I would say also just put very firmly on the table, one of the most important issues facing the academic study of religions, but which scholars have been very slow to engage with. And that was the troubling legacy of colonialism and Orientalism and its constitutive role in producing the discipline, in shaping its conceptual apparatus and its priorities. It was one of those texts, I think we could say, to coin a philosophical phrase, which shook the field out of its dogmatic slumber. Although I would say that since then, there's still been a lot of work to be done. Now, I've returned to this text repeatedly in the last 20 years, both in my own research, certainly in my teaching, to explore the politics of knowledge production and knowledge circulation and the insidious force of colonial conceptuality in shaping how we think, and indeed in telling us who this we is that we repeatedly evoke in the academy. It also teaches us how to escape the bind of coloniality in our disciplinary context, how to avoid its repetition. And Richard's work has really been a continual conversation partner for me over the years, and I've benefited hugely from his careful, humane, and illuminating scholarship. Now, even in this text, however, founded as focused as it was on European colonial production of the category religion and its construction, particularly of what we now name Hinduism, the book itself was replete with philosophical themes and reflections. And this is no surprise, given that Richard, from the very start of his career, straddled both the discipline of philosophy and the discipline of the study of religions. And much of his very extensive work in numerous published volumes, journal articles, conference papers, and the like, whether his text on Indian philosophy or the other one on the relationship between Advaita Vedanta and Buddhist thought, or his many articles really pursuing a decolonizing and post-colonial line of questions, has sought to find ways of speaking of and thinking with non-European intellectual traditions in ways that not only do justice to the rich variety of these traditions, and refusing to reduce them to that most colonial of tools, the category of religion, but also recognizes and puts to work their own conceptual apparatus in order to undo the hegemony of Western thought and to enable the decolonial work of thinking anew. Richard has been a great friend to us at SOAS in helping us, in fact, to put together the BA World Philosophies program, serving as an external examiner for the program and engaging with many fruitful and nourishing conversations about the potential of world philosophies to enable the long overdue overhaul of philosophy itself. Richard has worked in an impressive number of institutions: University of Stirling, University of Derby, Vanderbilt in the States, Glasgow, and finally, or most recently, the University of Kent. And it was there that he worked to establish a similar program in global philosophy. And so I'm so pleased he's here today to tell us about that work, to help us in our ongoing reflections about what decolonizing philosophy needs to look like, and perhaps more poignantly, the particular challenges this involves in a context of the neoliberal marketization of higher education and its instrumentalization of metrics as the measure of intellectual quality. So please join me in very warmly welcoming Richard to SOAS, well, just welcome him to SOAS. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Richard is speaking of today, which is really global philosophy, its possibility, its intellectual force and value. And the title of the talk is Reflections on Globalising Philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sian, for that lovely, kind and insightful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and the PowerPoint that I intend to use, because I think that will make things just a little bit easier. Let me see if I can, I'm sure there's an easier way of doing this, but how's that? Can you see that?
Perfect.
Great. I'm in a privileged position. Oh, first of all, thanks for inviting me to SOAS. I have to say, it's looking a lot like my office, but I'm in a kind of privileged position here because there are three dimensions of this that experience I want to bring to this. The first is that two of them relate to SOAS and one of them relate to Kent. I was consulted as an external consultant by the institution when the idea of world philosophies was first mooted as an idea at SOAS. So I was there watching the process right from the very early stages. And then subsequently, as Sian said, I served until recently as the external examiner for that BA program. So I've seen the early days of that program. And then thirdly, as Sian also said, in my own institution at the University of Kent, I came up with the idea of developing a degree which I called Global Philosophies. There are some questions there about that choice of title, which maybe we can get into in the discussion, but that was the choice that was eventually started on. And what I'd like to do today is draw upon some kind of theoretical ideas, but mainly in a way that's a little unusual for me, because I usually like revel in the abstract and the theoretical, is talk about some of the more practical aspects of offering a degree of teaching world philosophies based upon my experience both at a slight distance as an external observer at SOAS, but also in my own capacity when I was head of Department of Religious Studies at Kent, in terms of developing such a degree. So I'd like to begin by talking about some of the challenges and what I saw as the responses to those challenges in globalizing philosophy. I'll talk a little bit about some of those issues and how they fed in very practical ways into my structuring of the degree at Kent. And then we will look, I'll look at some of the kind of challenges, some of them institutional, some of them cultural, some of them economic, to that whole project. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have time not only for questions, but also I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and have a discussion about this whole project, which I see SOAS as at the forefront of. So I hope that you find these reflections of interest. So in terms of challenges to the globalization of philosophy, I would say that the first main one that I've struggled with quite a lot in my own work is the question of Eurocentrism, or the essentially summed up as the West is best bias, which is pretty well established within, not surprisingly, you might argue, the Western Academy, or the idea, not even that the West is best, but West is normative, that the way that Western culture, Western civilization has thought about the world is necessarily the natural or normal or best way of thinking about the world. And in reflecting upon this, I found that one of the ways to embed a response to that within the development of a degree is to reflect upon and recognize the social and cultural location of thought. I think that's an important element of the process of globalizing philosophy, is recognizing that what people are calling philosophy in different cultural contexts are formed within those contexts. So thought doesn't occur in the abstract, even though one can discuss it in the abstract. It's formed in social, cultural, and institutional ways. And this point is sometimes lost in mainstream philosophical discussion, the idea being we're not really interested in the social or cultural location of ideas. We want to discuss them, if you like, on their own logical or philosophical merit. So there's a kind of abstraction that occurs that I think does a disservice to our understanding of the complexity of those traditions and where they come from. A second challenge, which I'll come back to also at the end, is one of a disciplinary or institutional challenge. And this is the issue of disciplinary territorialization. SOAS, in some regards, was in a unique position for an institution of its kind, in that it does not have a freestanding independent philosophy department already in existence. The challenge that I had at the University of Kent was that there was already a philosophy department that did Western philosophy mainly, but not exclusively, in the kind of analytic framework or style, if you like. And so that creates a different kind of politic that perhaps is worth reflecting upon in terms of how you would develop such a degree, given that there's a department already in existence which is using that title. And the response to that, I would say, depends on local institutional conditions. So SOAS will have a different set of challenges, or did have, in relation to that. And at Kent, I had my own challenges in terms of keeping on board the philosophy department in these processes. And that was also one of the aspects behind the naming of the degree. It became clear that there was a great deal of anxiety, let's say, about the use of the term philosophy at Kent outside of the Department of Philosophy. And so that's one reason why the degree became known as Global Philosophies, because the study of philosophies was seen as somehow the kind of study of worldviews. That sounds like something a religious studies department might do, but it isn't philosophy, which is what we do in philosophy. And so there's a kind of territorial claim being made there, which affects the title of the degree. But there's a third issue, which I think is one that many people who work in the study of ancient, medieval, and historical forms have to encounter. And that's what I would call presentism, which is the deeply embedded set of assumptions in the modern academy, which tend to prioritize, sometimes without reflection, a kind of secularized model of modernity and a kind of implicit myth of progress. I see this kind of attitude being expressed quite a lot amongst colleagues in other departments who sort of think, for instance, that because I worked in religious studies, that religion is somehow passé, it's out of date, it's not relevant anymore. Yeah. But those kinds of issues one has to deal with. And I decided that in thinking through how to develop the program at Kent, that we would meet those full on. And so one of the kind of guiding principles I had in developing this degree was to challenge the exceptionalism of those accounts, because I think it's only if you do that that you are actually able to step outside of a very narrow disciplinary framework in terms of considering what is and isn't philosophy. So focusing upon one of the points I brought up, the locatedness of thought, I would suggest that Western philosophy is often presented, not always, and it does depend upon the style. Western philosophy, of course, is not a singular thing, but is often presented, particularly within those forms of or philosophical traditions that are sometimes called Anglo-American or more analytically oriented, as the discovery of universal truths based upon the abstract exercise of reason, the Greek logos. But the problem, and that but, it's a big but, if you pardon the phrase, is that philosophy will in fact look different depending upon its historical and cultural location. And we have to accept this point, I think. Otherwise, we are assuming that the conversations that we might be familiar with, when I say we here, I'm thinking of those who are trained within the white Western academy, the conversations that we are used to are not necessarily the only ways in which conversations can be had. I try and address this point to students by asking them to reflect upon when they go to a party. Maybe they just come, they're freshers at university, they go to a party, they don't know anyone, and they're maybe experiencing social anxiety, they're trying to fit in, they're trying to break into pre-existing groups who are already having a conversation. And within the terms of that conversation, there's the issue of how you enter into it. Do you enter into it and speak about the experience of those within that group? Maybe they come from a different part of the country or a different part of the world, and your background experience isn't the same. So in other words, we shouldn't expect when we go to these parties, when we develop something called World Philosophies or Global Philosophies, that the kind of thought that we will encounter will be the same. There will be local differences. There will be different points of emphasis. That's not to say there aren't commonalities, and I'm not making a kind of radical separatist claim that these are cannot talk across cultures, but we have to accept the reality of difference and not see that difference as a way of excluding some and not others from a widening of the conversation, which is what I see the globalization of philosophy as fundamentally about, a widening of the human conversation. Now, when we look back in Western culture at the whole question of the origins of philosophy, we'll see that there are basically two main strands. There's those who have argued that philosophy has begun independently in different places, Africa, India, the West, and so on, Greece, and those who argue very, very specifically for the Greek origins of philosophy. The word philosophy, of course, is philosophia, the love of wisdom. And I've given here just some examples on each side of writers and thinkers who have argued from these two different points of view. And I think it's fair to say that in recent centuries, since that debate arose, it was those on the left who argued for the pluralistic origins of philosophy who tended to be in the ascendancy. But that's not been the case in more recent times, and certainly throughout the 20th century, we've seen this idea that philosophy began in one particular place in Greece at a particular time, the specificity thesis, if you like, or and that has come to dominate 20th century accounts of the history of philosophy. And if you look at some of the key textbooks, for instance, which is often a way of tracking what the kind of general perception within the academic circles are, there's overwhelmingly a tendency to locate the beginnings of philosophy in ancient Greece. And of course, this is part of a longer tale of European exceptionalism. The idea that Greece is the birthplace of philosophy, that it's the birthplace of many of our ideas of democracy. So this involves, of course, a very, very specialized or specific way of approaching philosophia, seeing it as something that only really developed or developed in its most perfect form, if you like, as some might put it, in Greece. And this has often been portrayed as the triumph of logos, the spark of reason, of logical argumentation over ancient mythos, of myth. And of course, this is conceptualized in characterizations of Socrates, and the fact that he got into a great deal of trouble for questioning aspects of the mythological aspect of the gods, and focused upon the importance of drawing out wisdom through dialogue, through the Socratic dialogue. But I would argue that this story, which is quite modern in many respects, is itself an origin myth for philosophy, and it's something that philosophy should investigate. It should be part of the remit. And that's something I'll have something to say about. In this regard, I draw your attention, if you're not already aware of it, of the interesting article by Robert Bernasconi, who's written quite a bit about philosophy and race and philosophy, where he asks this particularly pertinent question. What is one to make, he says, of the apparent tension between the alleged universality of reason and the fact that its upholders are so intent on localizing its historical instantiation? And he goes on, I'll just put the longer quote here because I think this draws out some of the implications that he would see from this. He says, one cannot understand why there has never been a serious debate about the origin of philosophy unless one understands what is at stake in the question. Even if the history of the discipline and the conception of the discipline that history supports is not racist in design, the question must still be addressed as to whether it is racist in its effects. Whole peoples experience themselves as excluded, in part because of the systematic diminishment of the achievements of their group. Philosophers almost everywhere are implicated. The problem must be addressed not just in research, but also at the institutional level in each and every department. And of course, I want to focus in this talk on that last point, upon addressing that, excuse me, at the institutional level. So let me say a few things just to kind of pull this down into some specifics that we can then pull apart and discuss later, of how I conceptualize global philosophies at the University of Kent. How, for instance, does Global Philosophies, as it's called or was called, that's something we can get into, how does it differ from a traditional philosophy degree? So let me outline ways in which I think it's an attempt to be different. Firstly, perhaps somewhat obviously, is the global remit of the degree, that the degree would be explicitly cross-cultural and comparativist in orientation. Those of us who work or are disciplined within religious studies will know of the writings of Max Muller, the Indologist, and his famous axiom, which he took from adapting Goethe, that in the study of religion, he who knows one knows none. This idea that to truly understand something, you must look at, you must make the cross-cultural move. You must look at instantiations of it outside of one particular example, which he was putting forward, Muller, as a kind of basis for a science of religions. A science must be, you must be able to test the hypothesis. You must be able to have other examples to kind of test what you're studying. So there's a global and a cross-cultural dimension to that. Secondly, I very much argued at Kent that there had to be a historical element to this process, that there had to be a sense in which we were engaging philosophical ideas, but also engaging in the global history of ideas. Some of my colleagues in philosophy felt that there was a strong separation here, and that, although I think that's partly an illusion, there's quite a lot of history of philosophy in philosophy degrees, traditionally. But the idea that there's a kind of separation of method and work here was summed up in the idea that the belief that what we were doing in a religious studies department was a kind of history of ideas. We were kind of describing different points of view, presenting them, whereas what they're doing in philosophy is they're directly engaging with truth questions, with questions of philosophy as opposed to history of ideas. I think that distinction's overly drawn, but for me it was important to highlight the fact that this degree would be also a history of a global history of ideas. It's also important when using words like global that you recognize also the importance of the local. And so what I tried to embed in this degree was attention to the cultural, social, linguistic, and historical contexts of ideas, something that can perhaps be summed up in the idea of the social construction of knowledge and thought, that the ideas don't just exist in the abstract, that they occur in particular places, in particular times, and that those thoughts are thought through the medium of particular languages, a point that is sometimes not considered, let's say, in traditional philosophical discussions. And then the fourth aspect of this that I thought was important to embed in the degree was a certain reflexivity. The idea that if you were studying this degree, you would be engaging critically with issues of definitions, of boundaries, of the categories that you use, and also would be asked to reflect upon the question of translation. What goes on when you translate something? particularly when you translate a set of ideas or concepts that are embedded in a particular institutional form and language. As we all know, when you translate something, to put it rather simplistically, you add something, but you also take something away because it's a translation. And so part of the idea there is to be reflexive, to be aware of that process, that transformation, and that those definitions that we use, the categories that we use, and the translations that we use were part of the thing that we are studying. They are up for discussion in a kind of open-ended way. And that what we're doing when we're teaching students how to do this is we're making them reflect upon those fundamental conceptual tools that we are using. Now, I'm mentioning this because when I assume it's the same at the university, at SOAS, but at the University of Kent, when you are developing a new degree, you have to map its program aims, to a set of subject benchmarks. And so in developing this degree, I mapped the Global Philosophies degree in relation to 3 different areas, because I felt that this, and I'm mentioning this because I think this captures something of the phenomenon of the degree and what it's trying to do. So the 3 subject benchmark statements that I drew upon were philosophy, fairly obviously, but also languages, cultures, and societies, which allows for the historical and the translational and the hermeneutic questions that are, I see, part and parcel of this sort of degree. And then thirdly, area studies, because anyone who's studying world philosophies or global philosophies would have to be involved in the study of specific regions. And so those were the three kind of defining benchmarks in the kind of administrative process of developing this degree. And it will be interesting, I don't remember what you did at SOAS in terms of the benchmarks, but when we get to the discussion, it will be interesting to know which benchmark statements you used. So in developing this, what did I see as the kind of distinctive components of that degree, of the Global Philosophies degree? Well, philosophy often presents itself as, or at least philosophers present what they're doing as, the examination of fundamental or first principles. So you might do science, you might be studying religion, you might be studying the mind, but what philosophers do is they are studying that, but they're also studying the fundamental assumptions and principles underlying those fields. I see that as a constitutive aspect of what a philosophical approach is about. But one of the things that I found strange, and this relates back to Bernasconi's point, is that while we see courses on philosophy of religion or philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, what we don't see, and I think philosophers might try to argue that this is because it's implicit in what they do, but I'm not sure that it is in practice, is we don't see the philosophy of philosophy. We don't see that first stage examination of the very principle of what philosophy is, foregrounded within the subject. What we often find is that students are introduced to philosophy and the different ways of doing it, but they're introduced to it often in a historical way, and that historical way usually embeds a canon of who are philosophers and who aren't. And because that canon is usually heavily defined by European civilization, it tends to embed a set of assumptions about philosophy, which are strongly linked to the European tradition and to that tradition which locates itself in Greece, for instance. If you say that the first philosophers were like Thales, the pre-Socratic thinker, or you start looking at Plato and Socrates, you're already, even if you're not explicitly doing that, you're implicitly passing on a set of assumptions about what philosophy might be in its first principles. And so I felt that a degree such as this has to foreground, or as I would like to see it, complete the philosophy project, because the philosophy project is incomplete if it does not investigate itself and its own foundations. So the philosophy of philosophy is itself an aspect of that process. That's one way to put it anyway. Now, in terms of what world philosophies or global philosophies entails, I just briefly want to outline two models. There are other ways you can conceptualize this, and I'm sure we can complicate this, but for the sake of the discussion, the first model of world philosophy I would describe as adjunctive. It's liberal, multicultural in its intentions, which is to extend essentially Western philosophical discussions. I would often come across quote open-minded philosophers in various departments of philosophy in institutions I've worked in, who were interested in the work that I was doing and wanted to talk to me about the philosophical questions as they saw it. And it would soon become clear to me that for them, this was about finding correlates of their own sets of conversations within, in my case, Indian traditions, and then translating them into the terms of that conversation, and then engaging in a discussion. And this is in a certain level a kind of laudable thing, an extension of discussion and so on. But there was rarely a reflection upon the issue of the translation of those materials into the Western linguistic and conceptual framework. And this relates to what I considered to be a superior paradigm, which is to see world philosophy as a transformative exercise. That is, it involves an expansion of what philosophy means. And that expansion means something that is between and perhaps beyond specific traditions of thought. So from that point of view, when you bring Indian philosophical ideas, let's say, into a discussion that is about a particular issue, that the way in which that's approached, the linguistic differences, the historical and cultural and institutional factors that form those different discussions will create something different from those two. And that's much more than a kind of adjunctive idea of world philosophy. That's where one really is attempting to open up conversations and transform them in the process. Now, this project is very much part of what I would call the decolonization of wisdom. And I just wanted to mention, this is one of my favorite quotes from Michel Foucault. Foucault, in many regards, doesn't represent a good example of a post-colonial or decolonial thinker, because he's very much embedded within the European context. But this quote, which is from an interview that he had in Japan in 1978, I find quite an intriguing and an interesting one. This is what Foucault says. He's asked the question, by the way, he's in Japan, he's being asked whether Asian thought can help the crisis of Western thought. The question is the leading question to start with, but it's one that he accepts the premise of, and he replies in the following manner. It's true, European thought finds itself at a turning point. This turning point on an historical scale is nothing other than the end of imperialism. The crisis of Western thought is identical to the end of imperialism. The crisis has produced no supreme philosopher who excels in signifying that crisis. And he goes on, for it is the end of the era of Western philosophy. Thus, if philosophy of the future exists, it must be born outside of Europe, or equally born in consequence of meetings and impacts between Europe and non-Europe. Now, as I say, I'm not holding up Foucault as particularly a good example of someone who fulfills that project. I just find his analysis interesting, because what he's suggesting is that the impasse, the crisis, as he sees it, of Western thought is precisely linked to the fact that the West is no longer supported by the pillars of empire. Those disappear first in the military and political contexts, but they also, their underpinning of claims of intellectual superiority are also lost in that process. And in that process, the Western philosopher is exposed in the parochialism of the original claim that the West has or invented philosophy. Now, in my own work, I have been interested in this process of translating the love of wisdom, and particularly the question of who gets to decide what is it that we call philosophy. And so in a number of works in different kinds of ways, there are different ways to approach what I've written, I guess. But one of them is to consider the ways in which traditions of thought become classified as isms or religions when brought into discussion with European modes of thought. So many of the universalizing or globalizing intellectual traditions of the pre-modern world are the ones that have been classified by us in the West as religions or isms. Here are some examples: Judaism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Islam. Now, all of the above have been translated into Western Christian, arguably in some cases post-Christian paradigms through this concept of religion. And what I've tried to do in various works from Orientalism and religion onwards is try and highlight that and unpack ways in which, through that categorical move of placing them within the category of religion, this separates them from what the West would call philosophy, science, medicine, politics. Because of course in the classic Enlightenment or if you like, Westphalian worldview, that there's the separation of the secular and the religious, and so there are certain domains that are seen as public: philosophy, science, medicine, and politics, and certain domains that are seen as private, religion being a clear example. And if we don't question this separation, which is a separation that I feel quite strongly at an individual level, because I've always thought of myself as a philosopher, but I've never been institutionally recognized as a philosopher. I've always been located within a religious studies department. And that's where I'm disciplined by the institution. And it's always been a struggle to have conversations with other people who call themselves philosophers, because they don't consider what I'm doing to be philosophy. So it's something that I've, throughout my career, felt quite personally, but also, I think, reflective of a much larger issue about the classification of non-Western cultures and traditions. And of course, the kind of bottom line, the outcome of this is that it's through the unquestioning use of these separations that modern so-called secular Europe has been secured as the center and the focal point of world history. You get people like Dipesh Chakrabarty arguing that history essentially is mostly written as a kind of Xerox or a photocopy of European history, which is then adapted to fit regions. So you have Indian history, Korean history, and so on, which are essentially repeating some of the categorical assumptions of European historiography, but adapted to the region, but without thinking through the whole idea of what it might be to write a history from that region rather than of that region. So that brings up the question of what counts as world philosophy, the whole question of boundaries and definitions. And at one level, of course, it's relatively straightforward, given what has been said, to say what would count as world philosophy. It's, for want of a better phrase, global intellectual thought, the various philosophical traditions or intellectual traditions of the world. You might argue there's question begging there. You're already deciding that that's called philosophy. But certainly to expand philosophy and onto a world stage, examples: Greco-Roman, European, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Jewish, Christian, Egyptian, African, and so on. These are the kinds of things that one would imagine encountering within a world philosophy degree, to bring it down to that kind of curriculum level. But if you base the construction of the degree upon the second model that I outlined, the transformative model, then world philosophy is not a case of narrowly finding correlates or mirrors of modern Western philosophical discussions and traditions, or even of Christian theology. We have to, if you like, cast the light much further than that, because we can't assume that the particular cultural, historical, and institutional conditions under which philosophy emerges as a distinct discipline in the West will have occurred elsewhere. And so we have to be prepared to cast our light quite widely. Now, in trying to develop what this degree was about, which is again something that a degree that remains up for discussion even within itself, the approach I took again very much reflected my own youthful experience. As always, when developing undergraduate degrees, I think it's important to reflect, what was I thinking when I was 17? And I'm probably unusual. I suspect we all are as academics from most people in this regard. But when I decided to go to university, I decided to do, I wanted to do philosophy. But I was worried, because I looked into it, that what counted as philosophy when I looked at the courses seemed very, very Western. And I developed an interest since I was about 14 in what at the time I would have called Eastern philosophy. And I wanted to learn more about that. And so I learnt, even at that stage, that if I wanted to study that, I couldn't go to a philosophy department. I had to go to a religious studies department. So I ended up doing a joint degree. I did philosophy and religious studies. And so I'd be able to have the kind of in-depth study of Western philosophers in the philosophy part of my degree. But then if I wanted to look at anything non-Western, then I could cross the corridor and do that in religious studies. But the kinds of questions that drove me to want to do a degree in philosophy, I discovered were not really discussed very often in the philosophy courses that I was doing. We weren't discussing fundamental questions of meaning and identity. We would discuss quine and logical forms, and we would discuss qualia, theories of perception, philosophy of mind. We would look at ethics questions, but questions about fundamental human identity. What is my life about? What's the meaning of it? Where does meaning come from? These kinds of questions, whilst philosophers in the West talk about them, aren't necessarily those that are foregrounded in philosophy degrees. And so that turned me also towards the religious studies department, because of course in religious studies, those questions are very much part of the discussion. And so in terms of folding this in, I decided that the study of world philosophies at Kent, at least, should involve reflections upon world myth and literature. That we should look widely with a broad spectrum in trying to find philosophical ideas and thoughts, what humans have thought about the nature of the universe, of the human, of life and meaning, of gender and sex relations, of ethics, of community, of our relationship to nature. All of these things, attitudes, expressions of them can be found within what we would call mythological material. And so I folded that in to the degree. Now, one might argue there's some issues there, and I'm happy for us to discuss that, but that was a decision that I made, and we can discuss that. So that left a very broad remit for this degree at Kent. We had, for want of classifying this, we had philosophies, logos, but also myths or mythos as the things that would be studied. One of the questions that came up, and again, this is where one is also thinking locally and institutionally, was how to relate to a broad series of cultural phenomena that might not necessarily be, let's say, always focusing upon the cognitive. Within my department at Kent, half of my colleagues were not really philosophers. They worked within what you might call the sociology of religion. And so the question would be, there was a very practical question of how do you deliver this degree in a way that matches the staff that you have. And so this brought up the question, which I think is also one worth reflecting upon for anyone developing degrees such as this, is whether you should include the study of rituals and social institutions. It's one thing to extend the discussion to looking at myths, stories, if you like, but also much of how people express their sense of who they are or their relationship to animals or nature or to each other in terms of gender and so on, are embedded in rituals and social institutions. And so perhaps that's also a part of a broadened out philosophical remit. Again, that's one for reflection. Of course, Global Philosophies at Kent was about the study of worldviews, both ancient and contemporary. The kind of remit I felt for that was what is it that has oriented people's sense of human identity and meaning, both historically and today in the early 21st century. I feel more probably than at any point in the history of British higher education, when developing an undergraduate degree, we are forced by circumstances to think upon that in terms of relevance and market. That's not necessarily always a bad idea. You won't hear me say that very often, but in this context, it is good to reflect upon what speaks to people, what will speak to 17 and 18-year-olds in terms of meeting their interests of the life that they're living and the world that they're entering into. And that means a focus upon the contemporary. So as well as looking at ancient worldviews or what has often been classified as the world religions, I consider that to be part of the remit of what global philosophies would be about. I think it's also about looking at the forms of human identity and meaning construction that are prevalent in the modern world. Some examples: consumer capitalism, scientific rationalism, atheism. These are all ways in which people define their sense of who they are, either through the life that they practice or through explicit adherence to a particular view. So for me, I actually think this is also true for religion as I understand it. Part of the remit of such a degree would involve the examination of capitalism, of scientific rationalism, of atheism as aspects of ways in which people think about who they are and what the world is about. Then I just wanted to say a few things about the importance of the world or the global aspect as I draw things to a close. For me, one of the reasons I chose the name global rather than world, although you can decide on whether you think that's a good idea or not, was I wanted the degree to include within it some reflections on the nature of the global and of globalization itself as a term that requires understanding and interrogation. Because it's also the case that when people talk about globalization, they usually think of it as a very contemporary phenomenon. But I think that it's worth considering the argument, the idea that what we now call the world religions are often the partially globalized ideologies and belief systems of the previous era. The spread of Buddhism from India across to become a pan-Asian movement and in the modern period beyond that is an example of a kind of partial globalization. And one of the reasons why we study and why I study Buddhism is partly because of its success in that regard. So we can come to understand something of notions of the global and of globalizing processes through looking at those traditions. So in other words, part of the import of the world or the global aspect would be the study of previous globalizations. Examples, the spread of Buddhism, the Roman Empire, the missionary spread of Christianity, of Islam, the Mongol Empire, the British Empire, of course, the American Empire. And these moments, these historical moments, these trends, these processes, I see as part of the remit of the degree. But I also wanted to mark what I thought was significant about this degree in two fundamental levels. At the level of the individual student and at the macro level. So at the level of the individual student, in that degree, the idea is that we would also study now, the contemporary. And what would be folded into that would be what I think many students who become interested in such degrees are driven by, which is their own individual search for existential meaning around the world. I mean, that's certainly, I think, one of the dimensions of my own choice to choose the degree that I did. And I think that we still have within our student body, students who are on that kind of quest. And I think that's part of what this degree offers for them. But also at the macro level, it's the study of now in terms of reflections upon the global as it is now, on the socio-political, global media, politics, the spread of global capitalism, the rise of digital technologies, new forms of community that are forming in that context. What are the new philosophies and ideas that are linked to these new technologies and these new movements? These kinds of ideas and these kinds of modules were already in existence at Kent, and I'm sure you have some at SOAS too, but they were not considered philosophy necessarily, but within the remit of this degree, I considered them part of the whole process. Of course, there's a practical aspect to this. If you're building something like world or global philosophies, you have a challenge, which is what's available. what do you have in terms of academic staffing, modules that are already in existence? How can you draw upon other departments as they're classified to build this rather ambitious, I have to say, project? But so let me briefly tell you what I did at Kent, just so you have a sense of how I tried to create something out of very little at the University of Kent. So at Kent, what happened in the degree is that at the beginning, in stage one, students would do 2 core courses. One was called the Global Search for Meaning. And in that was really an introduction to the degree, to the kinds of things that I'd been talking about, to the idea of philosophy, to the idea of the study of myth, maybe the study of ritual, although that would come in the second module. And that would, of course, vary according to the staff involved, but would basically be exploring this very broad frame of exploring what it is for how humans have made sense of themselves and the world that they live in. And then in the second semester, they do a core course called Ethics, Society, and the Good Life. This was the module where some of my sociology of religion colleagues could contribute. And there it's looking at different notions of what it is to lead a good life. And that, again, that can be, these courses are created as shells in that modern way in which we do this with learning outcomes and so on, so that different staffing components can work within that dependent upon conditions like sabbatical. Remember when people had sabbatical? And so there it would be reflections on the good life, ethics and society in different cultural contexts. And then feeding into that, I folded into this some courses that weren't core for the degree, but were core for another degree that I developed at Kent, which was a degree in Asian studies. And so students would either do an introduction to South Asian traditions or an introduction to East Asian traditions. We didn't have the resources to be able to expand beyond that in terms of other traditions and other cultures. But it was important to embed within this the idea that you couldn't go through this course without some kind of at least early level engagement with, in this case, Asian traditions. And then when students moved into stage 2, they would have a core course called, it's not called that anymore, but it was called Understanding Global Philosophies. And essentially what this was a theory, a method course for global philosophies. It's how might you do this thing that I've just been talking about for an hour? What are the theoretical, hermeneutic, political, cross-cultural issues involved in that? And I put there the kind of extended description of what that module was about, but as you can see, it was quite broad, again, reflective of a kind of pragmatic need to allow for different staff members contributing their different expertise. But essentially, the focus there was not upon a reflection on different cultural traditions of thought, but upon the very kind of nitty-gritty, for me, theoretical, categorical, and methodological issues that are involved when you move your study into a cross-cultural space. And then, I mean, that might be seen, and I think it is, as quite bare bones. The rest of the degree was constructed out of modules that were taught at the University of Kent in a variety, in the philosophy department, in the religious studies department, courses on African history, sociology courses on media and on China and so on. So there was a wide remit of modules that were pulled in at that point, but this became the kind of spine of the degree. So let me finish my remarks with some notes of caution and a tale of defeat, because essentially when I developed the degree program in global Philosophies at Kent, it was probably arguably the worst time ever to introduce a new humanities degree, because we are, as you will all be aware, suffering a kind of crisis of the humanities in a higher education environment that has been marketized, and with with government regularly making statements suggesting that perhaps humanities aren't like the best degree to do. Maybe you should do STEM degrees instead. And so in that context, the fundamental question, which I think SOAS is much better placed than Kent was, is the question of, does the institutional platform match the scale, scope, and vision? So it's all very well at one level having this kind of grand vision of what philosophy might be in a globalized context. But if the institution cannot support that, ultimately, through a variety of factors, not just academic staff specialisms, but also at the basic level of humanities programs are shrinking, then that could be a killer issue. And I should say that, as far as I'm aware, the degree has not being presented to students for 2021 access. I've now left Kent, but I looked at the UCAS page, and I couldn't find it for 2021, although it's there for 2020, which doesn't surprise me, because it's very difficult to find a space for something called Global Philosophies that's necessarily got the, if you like, brand recognition of philosophy, when you also have a degree in philosophy being offered independently within the same institution. And that brings me to the second note of caution, which is the politics of intra-institutional competition. Who gets to use the label philosophy? SOAS, I think, has the advantage of not having within itself a freestanding philosophy department, which enabled that space to, if you pardon this way of speaking about it, to be colonized by religious studies. But I didn't have that advantage at Kent, where there was already an existing philosophy degree, and understandable anxieties about my attempt to introduce something that might be seen as a challenge to that degree. And that was one reason why I was not allowed to use the word philosophy. I had to pluralize it to philosophies. And I found that some of my colleagues would suggest that they'd have some students who they would consider less interested in the analytic, more interested in the spiritual. And they would say, oh, well, maybe you want to do global philosophies because maybe this isn't the right place for you. But so there is an issue there of intra-institutional territory. But of course, in this time that we live in, bottom lines and the economic environment are crucial. And fundamentally, anyone who's had to do this in any British institution knows that the fundamental question that's asked of the academics is there a market for such programs? And so that's always something that one has to foreground in getting these things accepted by institutions. It would be lovely if we could be driven by the academic vision, but there's also the kind of pragmatic market-based approach. But I would argue, I mean, SOAS has been successful in this regard, and I'm interested to hear more about that. But I would argue that actually one of the challenges that I'm about to mention is actually a demonstration that there is a market for these degrees. And that's the question of cultural politics. What we're seeing, and SOAS has, I think, had some backlash about this when the degree was introduced in places like the Daily Mail and so on, with claims about ignoring the white philosophers and so on. But what we've seen since then, even more, is a backlash against processes of decolonization going on within culture. There's the Black Lives Matter movement, which is an incredibly important movement and moment, but there's also the reaction to Black Lives Matter, which we're seeing particularly I thought it was particularly in American and British societies, but I also noticed recently discussions in France about what they saw as the importation of American theory in the form of critical race theory and decolonization approaches, which is ironic because, of course, anyone who works in those fields knows that even though those kinds of debates are quite well developed within the American Academy, many of the fundamental theorists are Francophone or French, like Kristeva, Frantz Fanon, Foucault, Derrida, and so on. And so, but what this reflects is a kind of reaction against what American conservatives have called cultural Marxism or critical race theory. We've even seen conservative politicians criticizing critical race theory. And I note, I think today, a government minister saying that to focus upon colonialism in school teaching in Britain would be, adding on too many subjects, a dilution of quality and so on. And so there's this kind of resistance to these kinds of developments and decolonizing trends. But for me, that in itself, those controversies actually demonstrate the cultural relevance of these kinds of approaches and these kinds of degrees, because they reflect not only the shifting geopolitical context of our time, but they're also now hot button issues within our society and our culture. So I think I'll stop there, and that will give us a chance to have any questions and discussion that might come out of that. Thanks.
Thank you so very much, Richard. I think we had a lot of information that got us thinking from all directions. Very rich and very carefully developed. Thank you so much. Sean was right about the quality of lecture we were going to get today, and we did get it. So without wasting time, we would like questions and comments to emerge. Please use the raise hand feature and go ahead with your questions, please. Yeah, let's begin with Val.
Hi, thank you so much for this extremely interesting talk. My question is more, I guess, philosophical. And I mean, with the issue of like using the word philosophy or like philosophies plural, and I mean, so thinking about kind of like an ideal world situation, right, in which like other philosophical traditions are taken seriously in their own right as proper, I don't know, not equals, but on the same footing as the kind of Western tradition stemming from the Greek world or whatever. I mean, is there a use in that world for the word philosophy? I mean, even today, right, in the kind of very narrow way that we use the word philosophy to look at the Western tradition, there's already an extreme dilution of that term, right? I mean, philosophers who are working in philosophy of science do very, very different work from philosophers who are working on critical theory. And so to what extent is this even useful now? But in the broader sense of like looking at other traditions who actually do philosophy differently, right? The use of that, I think, is maybe comes into question. Though I also see the point of you know, we don't live in that ideal world. And so there is a need for using this term philosophy just, you know, to create a sense that actually these are valid traditions that just look at things differently. It doesn't mean that they're lesser than the Western tradition and so on and so forth. So yeah, sorry if this is a bit confused. I've been thinking about this recently, and yeah, I would love to hear your slightly clearer thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Val. No, I think that's very clear. Yes, I think that the question of what counts as philosophy is, for me, something that should absolutely be at the foreground of this kind of project. And it's something that probably you would never come to a definitive answer to, because there are different ways in which you can respond to the question. I mean, you could say, for instance, as some have, well, you know, philosophy refers specifically to this thing, philosophia, that the Greeks invented. It's a particular kind of way of doing things, of thinking, and it only happens in the West, unless it's exported in that kind of way. And whilst that can be seen as a kind of ethnocentric construction of philosophy, it is a position that one can take, because one can say, because I'm assuming that one isn't necessarily saying there is no interesting, let's say, abstract, intellectual, systematic thinking that went on outside of the West. If you're making that claim, then you're making an ethnocentric, perhaps even racist claim. But if you're simply saying there's something in the West that's very, very particular and specific, and it's this kind of Greek-based origin tradition of critical reflection, you could make the case that that's very, very because if you don't do that, then you have to give up the universal claim that philosophers often make, that philosophy is about the search for wisdom wherever it occurs. And so I think there are different ways in which you could kind of approach that question, as long as we're clear about the implications of how we define philosophy. And I think that because it's a definitional question, we always have to look at the context of the discussion, because I can follow someone down different lines of argument about whether there is such a thing as Indian philosophy, there is Indian systematic thought, but I could equally say, was there anything like darshana or anviksiki, which is kind of analytic, investigative reasoning in Sanskrit traditions? Is there such a thing in the West? And so we can engage in that kind of discussion, but we have to keep in mind not only the definitional question, but the politic of it. Because of course, one of the reasons why we want to hold on to the idea of philosophy is about cultural prestige. Philosophy has been used to present, particularly when it's used in a kind of ethnocentric way, to say the West has philosophy, often to make some kind of claim that, well, it's only in European forms of thought that the kind of highest forms of rationality have been expressed. We find this, for instance, in Hegel at certain points in what he's saying, and other thinkers. And so this, in that point of view, we have to also recognize the history, in that, of course, theology was originally the queen of the sciences in the medieval university. But in the modern university, after the Humboldt, in a sense, the Humboldtian university, philosophy was established as the queen of the sciences. I would argue that today, in contemporary Britain, business studies is probably the queen of the sciences in terms of the most dominant model for and success as well. But still, there's this cultural prestige associated with the idea of philosophy. And as long as there's cultural prestige and a claim about higher forms of thinking, then I think it's perfectly acceptable for us to say, hold on, there are forms of thinking that we could call philosophy beyond Euro-American thought.
Thank you. Could I do a quick follow-up on that, if that's all right?
Sure.
Yeah, is that okay? With the SOAS part of things as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thanks. So actually, I'm working at the moment on kind of potentially kind of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian origins of Greek thought. And something that I struggle with a lot is kind of unlearning that Western bias. I've had quite like a traditional philosophic education. And so kind of thinking about things like epistemology and in a very kind of like boxed up way. And so I find that oftentimes I'm perhaps like reading into these earlier traditions, these Greek notions. So, I mean, do you have any, I don't know, practical tips, I guess, on like how you can unlearn this Western bias or this Western way of thinking about what philosophy is, perhaps?
I would say that I'm not sure we can ever unlearn them in that kind of pure way, but we can complicate them. And so that's why, for me, the whole question of the kind of lexicon of technical vocabulary that we use to interpret these different texts, traditions, myths, whatever, we have to be aware that they are lenses that we're wearing that have been formed in particular ways, have their own traditions. Often when we're doing this in the Western Academy, we're doing this through the medium of English, for instance. Not always, but a European language, certainly. And so always having that in the foreground of your study. So you're not just studying the ancient material that you're studying, you're also being reflexive about the framework that you're using to engage with that and thinking about that. I mean, that would kind of be my basic advice on that.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. I think we'll take 2 questions at a time. So you respond once to 2 questions. Yeah. So let's have Beth and Mohammed. Yeah, your hands have been up for a long while.
Hello. I was just wondering, considering there was already a course for philosophy at the University of Kent, what was your thinking behind making a separate course instead of innovating the current course, and whether that ideology you referred to with the MPs was perhaps being mimicked in the university hierarchy and that there's no space in the current course to innovate?
Mohammed?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so like in science, physicists won't compete with biologists for the title of being a true scientist. So why is there this sort of notion in philosophy where there's only one true type of philosophy?
Okay, thank you. Those questions actually dovetail with each other. And I would say that the reason why I introduced the degree, well, I'll give you the kind of pragmatic economic side of it, is that the religious studies degree was getting less and less applicants, but what we taught within that degree was very, very philosophical material across different cultural traditions and periods of history, but was not recognized as such because it was classified within this box called religious studies rather than being a philosophy. But we also had a philosophy department which was quite comfortable with I think with the way in which it's defined, and its current parameters, and was resistant to the implications that perhaps it was ethnocentric, and so I was not going to get much traction institutionally by going the route that you suggested. So the route that I went was to say, well, let's do something a little bit different. You do your philosophy thing, and you know, fine, you know, you've got students for that. We'll do our philosophy thing. My suspicion was that would, if it was successful, would have been a takeover bid, because if it was me, and as I said, I try and put myself in the position of what I was thinking when I was 17 and applying for degrees. The degree that I was developing was exactly the degree I would have wanted to have studied, but it was not available. And so what's always happened throughout my time as a scholar of religion in small religious studies departments is that we have picked up lots of students in the system who find out that religious studies isn't the weird, strange Bible study that they thought it was. And so we would always get a lot of philosophy students who would switch and do a religious studies degree. So based upon that anecdotal evidence, I thought if I'd built a degree which foregrounded and named itself as doing this, that would capture those people at an earlier stage. But you know, you're always in these contexts working in terms of these territorial bases, which are what departments really are in that kind of context. To answer Mohammed's question, I'm not sure I'm going to give a good answer to this, but maybe other people would give a good answer to this. But I think it's the role that philosophy has played in certainly the last few centuries as being seen as the pinnacle of human intellectual reflection. There's a kind of hierarchy of like higher level reflection, and philosophy has often been seen as the highest level of reflection, of systematic rationality, if you like. And whenever you make claims of rationality that you then particularize, whether it's to this is rationality and this isn't, or these people have this ability or this tradition of thought and these people don't, then you get involved in cultural politics, which in the period in which this was happening, of course, gets folded into colonialism and the justification of colonialism. And if we have the highest form of rationality and it's expressed through this thing we call philosophy, which Socrates did, and then the Europeans did it, maybe the Muslims did it for a while, but for instance, that there's often this kind of idea that the Muslim culture acted as the kind of postal workers for philosophy. So they took what Aristotle and Plato said, carried it around for a few centuries, and then passed it back to the Europeans, who then used it and developed it, and so on. That kind of model suggests that philosophy has been deployed as a technology for justifying colonial superiority of the West. And that's one reason why that has been a contested issue. Maybe other people have something to say on that, I don't know.
Thank you, Richard. Let's hear from Andrew and then Michael.
Thanks, Richard, very much for your talk, and apologies for coming in a bit late. I just have a question on, it might be a bit about the adjunctive side you talked about, which is kind of, oh, so you're doing that over here too, and it kind of seeing one's own values spread out. And specifically in terms of terminology, so thinking about what are the limits of using specific terminology that we might find within our own traditions to describe activity that we might find similar in other traditions. So what's the limit of terminology there? So I'm thinking, for example, you know, a classic thing might be like Plato's Aidos. Sometimes that's compared with Samanya in Sanskrit, and you have to excuse my pronunciation, I'm not a Sanskrit specialist. And so what's the limits of kind of using key terms from our own traditions? And the second related question would be about time and focus. So in this, when we think about more than one tradition, do we do injustice in the sense of not giving time for literally just thinking about Samanya for a few weeks, as opposed to kind of trying to desperately compare 2 or 3 different traditions in one session? And I think that's my anxiety as a lecturer sometimes, actually, is not giving justice that's needed to be. So those are kind of the 2 related questions: the limits of terminology, and on related note, kind of giving time to ample time for various traditions in this comparative type model. So those are my 2 questions.
Do you want me to take those 2 questions and then, or?
Yeah, that's fine.
Michael? Okay.
That's fine.
Thanks, Andrew. They're very good questions, and I don't think they have, for me, I don't have definitive answers on them. But I do have something to say on them. And I guess one of the challenges here is trying to think systematically and get students to think systematically in a modularized system of knowledge. So, you know, we're always packaging things within a certain number of weeks within a semester, and I don't want to underestimate the impact that has upon deep reflection. And I don't think that's just about global philosophies. I think that's about the kind of education that we're model of education we're pushed into. So there will always be that question of, you know, how do we find the time to kind of get into the in-depth meanings of Samanya or whatever the concept is in a kind of way that we find ethically responsible, let's say. We're always having to cut corners to be broad. So I don't think there's a definitive answer to that in that framework. On the question of terminology, limits of terminology, for me, again, I think it's a question of never resting comfortably with the translated terminology that we are using. It's not that we can't use it, but that we have to keep always coming back to the question of, this is a translation of a term or a concept or a practice that's, and we have to pull that back. So in other words, there's always a footnote to the use of the terminology. And I also someone who's, I quite like Tal al-Assad's idea in Genealogies of Religion. He talks about the inequality of languages and the fact that in the modern academy, for instance, Sanskrit is unequal to English. English is a hegemonic linguistic medium. And so when we're dealing with traditions and languages that are not the dominant languages that we're using, then he argues that we have to maintain a certain kind of scandalous element in the translation. The translation has to maintain the otherness of the original, just to constantly remind us when we're using the term that this doesn't easily translate into the lexicon of the words that we're used to using. And I quite like that as a kind of methodological reminder of holding on to that kind of scandalous nature of the original language.
Thank you, Richard. Michael, I think you can go ahead now, then Anya.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed that talk. I think it's really interesting. It was a nice way to kind of, as we're coming to the end of my degree at SOAS, it's a nice look back to see, you know, how it came into being, which was really, really quite nice, actually. So my question is twofold. So firstly, do you think that the making of philosophy into this institution, particularly by the British government at the moment, and by that I mean locating it kind of in this conversation, this very anxious conversation about identity, critical race theory, if you think that locating it there is making it actually more difficult to expand and the project that we're trying to do with World Philosophies. And secondly, do you think that we run the risk in World Philosophies or Global Philosophies of becoming just this critical commentary on the analytic tradition, and how would you kind of counteract that in any courses that you would construct?
Okay. Thanks, Michael. Yes, I quite like the use of the word anxious there, because I think it is there's a lot of anxieties in that, and I'm someone who actually thinks it's important to express anxieties and hold on to anxieties when we're dealing with these kind of complex issues and issues of power imbalance and cultural translation and so on. On the first question, which I took to mean something like this, is this a kind of a dangerous kind of, not exactly a blind alley, but a dangerously narrow way of going if we focus, if we kind of link this to discussions of critical race theory, reactions to Black Lives Matter, decolonization? Was that your...
I think because this was much clearer in my head when I wrote it down, but more along the lines of, is it more so that we're being shoehorned by states that very much want to politicize changing disciplines like philosophies into an attack on Britishness, an attack on the status quo as we know it? And is it actually not us expanding the discipline that's becoming the problem, but rather that we are creating, or we are a kind of response or a trigger for the anxiousness that people feel around Brexit or around critical theory?
I would, from my own experience, I would say that I don't experience this as a reaction to recent government statements. I've been working in this field for over 25 years, thinking about these kinds of questions. What's surprising to me is that this has become a sufficiently noticed by political figures on the right that they are, to use a phrase that's used quite often now, weaponizing it in a kind of cultural politics and the construction of things like cultural Marxism, which is apparently the and deploying that in certain kinds of ways, in a way that I may be wrong here, but I saw this as something that developed initially in the US amongst Republican groups, and then has caught on in British context, and that's why I thought it was Anglo-American, but then I noticed that this is also happening in France and no doubt elsewhere. So for me, I don't see it as a reaction. The reaction is the other way around. Finally, I've gone my entire career without any politician noticing anything I ever wrote or said. Finally, politicians are actually commenting upon the kind of area that I've been working in, and I found that a little bit perplexing. But I also think that's also capturing a moment. There are shifts going on. There are geopolitical shifts going on. Brexit is an example, a complex example of British reaction to its own empire and its own history, and how we make sense of that, how we narrate who we are in a post-imperial context. I'm always surprised how long it takes for these things to enter into the public consciousness. And that's why I was interested in the Foucault point, because I think that what Foucault was essentially saying was that the European empires, the British Empire, ended just effectively after the Second World War. That's quite a long time ago from the point of view of an individual human being. But it seems to take many generations for the impact of that culturally to start to unfold. And I see Brexit as part of a reaction to that unfolding impact of the fact that Britain no longer rules the world and is not going to go back to being ruler of the world, and how you come to terms with that. And there are, of course, different reactions. So I see the reaction as going on not from the academics as from the politicians who are now seizing upon what academics are saying on that. And then your second question was about whether we end up engaging in too much critical commentary and not enough philosophy. Is that? I think there is a danger of doing that too much. I could spend an entire course talking about the issues of translating certain Indian philosophical terms into Western ones without actually talking about the Indian traditions. And that's why I think that it's important that there are courses that focus on the primary remit of those courses is let's get into the nitty gritty of these particular traditions and practices and so on. But I think we need to be aware of these kind of methodological and critical lenses, but in some courses they would be foregrounded a lot, and in some they would be there, but they wouldn't be necessarily, always on the front page.
Thank you. I phrased my questions poorly, but that organization of philosophy in this cultural debate we're having now is precisely what I was getting at. So thank you.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Anya, and then Missy, sorry, I think I'm struggling to pronounce your name.
Max is fine. Max is
good. Thank you. So Anya, and then you go ahead.
Hi, Richard. I have to say it's a pleasure to meet you. I cite you all the time in my essays, and it's wonderful. It's very strange and wonderful to be able to put a face to the King (1999). So yeah, as you have many times before, you've wonderfully given me words to explain conflicting feelings that I've had in readings that I've done and concepts that I've studied. So today it's been the idea of transformational philosophy. I wish I had this terminology a couple of weeks ago. I was writing an essay about this for Elvis. But yeah, so I wanted to ask you about, I really appreciate how optimistic you were at the end of your talk, bringing up Black Lives Matter. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the realities of this. So I cannot see how in today's climate, with the marketization of universities happening in a very real way that is affecting, the academics, it's so close to my heart, their workloads, it doesn't seem like it's enabling space for this transformational philosophy to grow and prosper, and ideally overtake whatever the usual old colonial version of philosophy that persists in every other UK university. So how can it happen with our academics not losing their poor minds in the social structure that we've got in this marketized system? I just can't fathom it, because everyone's getting axed. As you said, these departments are shrinking, so it seems counterproductive to put energy into changing. It's like shoveling the snow while it's still snowing, I suppose. And because I'm thinking about my career, of course, and I would love, it was my dream to be an academic, but it's seeming so difficult. And I'm wondering whether my energy is more, it'd be more targeted use of my skills to try and change the structure of, the world and the government, to enable transformative philosophy to blossom.
Shall I respond to that?
Okay, maybe Ms. Emiliano, please.
Yeah.
Ask your question.
Yeah, actually, my question is also related to this. First of all, it's a great speech. I really enjoyed the speech, and I really enjoy people who push the boundaries of philosophy. And it's nice to be back at SOAS. I did my PhD there, and now I'm teaching Chinese philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at Warwick University. One thing that I noticed when I started teaching here is that actually students are really enthusiastic about non-Western philosophies. So my point is that we are talking about there is no market for this kind of modules or this kind of courses, but are we really sure there is no market, or it's a political problem and the market is there, but there is resistance even to try to taste the market. So in the end, my question for you is, how do we change the politics of philosophy department?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Max. Thanks for that. Again, thanks. It's really good that these are dovetailing these kinds of questions. On Anya's point, I feel your pain as someone wanting to move into an academic career or considering it in the current kind of climate, because you're right. I kind of left it on a slightly optimistic note, but we are looking at the harsh realities. We're looking at a kind of constriction of humanities, the marketization of universities, and so I actually want to support you in like your ideas of direct political engagement. Why not? But on the other side of that, I do think, and this is also try to answer Max's early point, was that this it's not a purely bleak outlook, and there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that there is the increasing awareness of issues like Black Lives Matter, decolonization, and so on in the mass media now, is allowing the terms for a cultural conversation, which universities, even university managers, cannot ignore. As somewhere like SOAS, which has a very diverse ethnic group of students, the voices of those students in saying, you know, why am I only ever hearing about dead white males and so on, is an important, powerful voice in a marketized context, because students are, the consumer is always right in that. We might not like that model, but that's the model that we're placed within. So I'm quite optimistic in the sense that, responding to Max's point, I actually think that within the younger generation, these kinds of issues are much more natural to think about. I mean, notions of acceptance of different forms of sexuality, of different kinds of gender formations, of people of different ethnic groups. Just, you know, of course we're equal. You know, why would we not be equal? That kind of baseline idea within younger British generation, for instance, I think, means that these kinds of questions, when they suddenly encounter, what you mean philosophy? I don't get to hear about what, you know, Black Africans or Indian people thought about anything. Why? Those kinds of questions come up because of that shift, I think. But there are two other aspects to this. One is that universities, perhaps not in this particular moment because of the pandemic and Brexit, but even with Brexit, the managers are constantly talking about internationalization. And what they often think of this in terms of is making lucrative links with like Chinese universities or something like that to get kind of recruitment numbers up. But there is a side of that which is about the internationalization of curriculum. And the kind of thing that World Philosophies at SOAS is doing is a brilliant example of internationalization. And so within the institutional framework of universities, that's a voice that can kind of capture some traction. But then finally, I think the very problem creates a reaction. And I think that the very fact that universities have been marketized so much, and we live in such a marketized, instrumentalized society, I think, maybe I am naive in this regard, means that there will be some young people who respond to that by saying, you know what, if I'm going to go to university and I'm going to have to pay fees for it, I'm damn well going to do something that I'm interested in. And that gives me some to fill this kind of spiritual vacuum that I get from everything else that's out there. So I'm really going to do this as a kind of vocational thing. And I think the more and more people feel commodified, there will be people, and are people, who say, no, I'm not having this. I'm going to kind of explore these things because you know, I'm a rounded human being, not just a worker in the global economy. So I actually think that marketization, as it speeds up, creates, I think, a kind of possible market, ironically, for people who are against or resistant to that. So I don't know if that answers. So I think that's my response to Max's point as well. Are we sure there's no market? I think that there is, and I think that somewhere like SOAS is ideally placed to, if of any institution in the UK and probably around the world, to kind of pioneer this kind of project.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for your questions. Sean?
Thank you, Richard. That was really great, really good to hear. When you were talking about your program development at Kent, and you were kind of listing the various difficulties that were faced in kind of getting it off the ground and getting that kind of cooperation and so on, it struck me that perhaps, I mean, you in some ways you cover it when you talk about that, you know, there's this kind of backlash. But I think I would kind of push you to be a bit more specific about it. And that is that philosophy itself is a racist discipline. Racist by omission, for sure, but racist in its preoccupations, in its faculty, in its reliance on its canon, its total failure to address the racist comments made by philosophers, at least from the Enlightenment onwards, where at least we have a concept of race, and so on. And you know, when we had that big debacle with the Daily Mail kind of saying that we were, you know, removing all white philosophers from the curriculum, etc. My point back to that was actually what's more problematic? The fact that we want to include people of color on our curriculum, or the fact that philosophy departments do not, under any circumstance, include any work by anyone from any other philosophical tradition, let alone what color they are. So I'm kind of wondering, my question, so this is a question rather than a comment, is what is to be done to tackle the racism of philosophy as kind of one of the major stumbling blocks to enabling world philosophy to become philosophy, to become normative, to become just the way philosophy is done?
Thanks for pushing me on that regard. I think again, this partly depends. This can depend on circumstances. So, for instance, if you're working in an institution where the philosophy department is much bigger and much more powerful and recruiting a lot more students than, say, a religious studies department, then you don't really have the power to for that kind of full frontal direct challenge. I mean, just in terms of strategy, it's just not going to work because it's going to also alienate colleagues who, in other regards, might be seen as working in synergy with you. But I think SOAS is slightly different because you don't have that issue. You have issues of having to resist those kinds of ideologies and those beliefs, but you don't have an institutional department within SOAS that's pushing back all the time, saying, hold on a minute, we're doing the philosophy, get off our territory. So I think that can be, it depends on the context. I would say that the problem with philosophy departments, almost universally, is that they are racist, even if it's a form of racism that most of them are not prepared to engage with. And it's often a kind of lazy racism because they've not been challenged. So not at Kent, but another institution that I worked at where there was a philosophy department, I was I gave a talk about expanding philosophy many years ago, and one of the professors in the philosophy department didn't go to my talk, but knew I'd given it, and said, why do you think it is that philosophy departments don't teach Indian philosophy apart from the obvious reason? And I said, what's the obvious reason? And he said, we don't have time. You know, we've got all of these other thinkers to look at. We don't have, and it's the same argument that the Tory minister made about colonialism. We haven't got the space to consider this. And that's because they consider this a kind of marginal add-on to the real stuff, rather than something that actually transforms your understanding of what you're doing. And so I would say that what we really have to do, and there are some people who've written about this, you yourself, myself, and other people, is actually confront them more and more with the realities of that kind of soft, incipient racism. Because then they have to defend themselves. And then once they start putting out their arguments and then realizing that those arguments don't hold much water, then we might see some traction. But it's a difficult one because, as I say, you can end up alienating colleagues.
Thank you, Richard. Beth, you have the last question. But before that, I just wanted to bring Richard's attention back to what you said about philosophy's self-critique, the philosophy of philosophy, what is often called meta-philosophy. Yeah. I think even in the West, it only exists in the very strict sense of analytic philosophy. Remember Wittgenstein, and even recently Timothy Williams's 2007 book on philosophy of philosophy is still very much in that, although it's a critique of the analytic philosophy, it's still very much in that analytic tradition. But I was just thinking, is it not therefore very, very important that in designing a program on world philosophies or global philosophy, that we begin, at least the students, first of all, introduced to a module of meta-philosophy or philosophy's self-critique, you know, and really play around that concept of philosophy and see exactly in what working definition it means all through that program. But I think it really got me thinking what you mentioned. We really don't engage with philosophy itself. You know, we just have this assumption and presupposition that we know what we are talking about. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Thanks, Elvis. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that for me, if I could kind of build a program that wasn't based upon like fitting certain colleagues in certain courses and so on, I would absolutely start off with some kind of discussion of what philosophy is. The notion of philosophia, I would go to different cultural places and time periods, and I would foreground that question of, you know, what is this thing called philosophy? And I would foreground it not in the form of, I'm informing the student what philosophy is so you know what you're going to study for the next 3-4 years, but in letting them know that this is a question they will continue to think about throughout their degree, that there's no clear answer, and I'm not introducing them to a canon, I'm introducing them to a problem. And so that's how I would approach that approach. And I think one way to do that is precisely to hone in on the question of where did it begin, because that can open up that kind of discussion. I think Beth, go for it.
Hi.
Beth, go first.
How would you respond to this relates to the last couple of questions. How would you respond to the idea that to make what is regarded within this call as I'm trying not to say better concept of philosophy, but the way that the people on this call have expanded philosophy in universities with these degrees, and considering, as we've said, that humanities are being axed so much in higher education, would you perhaps consider that we could use the platform of higher education to inform lower levels of education in A-level and GCSE, where those core subjects are a bit more secure within GCSE and A-level, to perhaps change that curriculum that's actually more achievable than getting individual universities to innovate their degrees?
Yeah, I mean, there are some hurdles there. And I back in the 60s, talking in terms of religious studies now, there was a time when, because of changes going on in British society, recognition of greater multiculturalism, migration of diaspora communities into Britain after the war, there was a kind of recognition that the old way of doing the study of religion was a bit too Christian, a bit too theological, and that perhaps there might be a space for a kind of multicultural, multi-religious space. And that's where departments like University of Lancaster, Department of Religious Studies, and the University of Kent were both founded in that 1960s moment, where there was a opportunity to say, look, the way we're studying this doesn't necessarily map the demographic of British society. We need to kind of expand this out. But that was an interesting moment, because at that time in the 60s, those who decided on school curriculum were still in conversation with academics in higher education. I think the challenge today is there's a separation, and universities aren't listened to by government ministers. They don't look to universities to necessarily define school curriculum in that way. What we find is government ministers increasingly interfering, bringing their own agenda of what they think a good education is, without necessarily bringing in, certainly in our area, people who work within that field. So there's a question of isolation, political isolation for universities there. But I agree. I think if you can insert those at an earlier stage in the curriculum, then that is so much better. Because of course, my experience in recent times with 9K fees is that the student applicant body are sometimes quite conservative, and quite understandably so. I mean, people might say, well, I'm not going to go and do a degree in that subject because I don't know what it's about. I never heard about this at school. So I'll do English or history or something like that. And so if we can embed those ideas earlier, then people will become aware of them, and they're much more likely to apply to university to study them and put pressure on institutions to internationalize. But the question is how the institutions get more traction with politicians in terms of being involved in those curricular discussions.
As a tiny follow-up, if that's okay, I think it's an interesting thought that perhaps the inclusion of non-Western ideologies be almost a requirement as much as a certain grade at A-level to get into university. You know, that like they talk about Western philosophy being the basis of knowledge, and then everything is additional, like you were saying, where it's almost like half of your knowledge is not there. So I wonder if there is a position that universities could have, that while they say you have to know this, this and this, and be at this standard of education to come to university, you also have to have a more informed knowledge, not just that specific.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that that there could be more done there. And I think that the kind of model of universities as a kind of factory for people who are then going to work in global capitalism doesn't even fulfill itself, because if you really want your graduates to become CEOs of international, globally relevant companies, let's say, if that's the kind of aim you're looking for, then they need to be globally trained as citizens as well. They need to understand what it is to think in different cultural contexts and so on. And I think we probably could do more as academics in making that case for the humanities in that kind of globalized space.
Thank you, Richard. I know we've gone over time a bit, but I was just wondering if you could quickly respond to one more question. Alex raised it in the chat. Alex, would you like to just ask verbally, or should I read it out? So, yeah, I know it was about labels, the use of labels, German, Indian, European. Sorry, let me just see if I can get the question. Yeah, so if I may write a question about, okay. I have a question about a few of the labels that are commonly used, assuming that labels are important for content, at least indirectly. Like many of us, you speak of Indian, European, German, French, etc. philosophies. There are, of course, these are, of course, names of current geopolitical entities. With German philosophy, one could perhaps try to speak of German-speaking philosophy to capture anything from Kant, to Wittgenstein and all of that. However, that won't work for terms like European or Indian. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this, or perhaps a pragmatic solution. Yeah, thanks for an amazing lecture.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, again, we're caught here in a space between a modularized framework of knowledge where you have to present and market modules in a particular kind of way. So if I'm teaching a course on what I might describe as Indian philosophy, but in the description, you'd realize that I'm not looking at the entirety of Indian philosophy, because no one could in a modular structure. For instance, why is Islamic thought not very often taught in a course on Indian philosophy, whereas there have been Islam has been an important part of Indian culture for a very, very long time, but because of these kinds of regional cultural kind of divisions, I mean, I for instance, what I teach is really a kind of in Indian philosophy courses is really a kind of high Sanskrit scholastic literature, and I think it's important to show that you're doing that in the description, and also to question the terms of that at some point within the course. So, for instance, in my Indian philosophy course at Kent, I spend the first 3 weeks talking about what philosophy is and what Indian philosophy is before we even get into any of the nitty-gritty. But you also have to be aware of the fact that students might not necessarily opt for a course that's called high Sanskrit classical intellectual thinking. They're looking for something that they understand is called Indian philosophy. And so we're constantly caught with these labels, which are there to kind of convey a certain fudged idea that people will understand. And then it's in the context of the course, I think, where it's our responsibility to complicate that label.
Thank you very much, Richard. We really want to express our sincere gratitude to you that you honored us, and you made yourself available for the first edition of the SOAS World Philosophy Lecture Series. Although we gave you quite a short notice, but you did real justice to the topic, and everyone benefited one way or the other from it. Thank you so very much. And thank you all for coming and for sharing your questions, your comments, both verbally on the chat. We'll be looking forward to
organizing this.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to seeing you on April 30, which will be the second edition, and with another speaker and another theme. And we'll inform you through the usual channels as well. Thank you all for being here, and we wish you a beautiful weekend ahead. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Richard. That was fantastic.
So